So with UBL, it stands for Universal Business Language. It is an OASIS technical committee. It's developed and maintained by OASIS, but it is also an ISO standard, ISO IEC 1984-5 2015. UBL was developed with a starting point in a format which you might have heard of or might use, CBL, XCBL, way early in 2002, 2003. There were some early adopters like Sweden, where I come from, and Denmark, who started using UBL in early versions already 13 years ago. UBL 2.1, which is the version that is now available and which is also the one which is pointed out in the syntax list. It has 62 business documents in total. It's built up by a library of components such as address and party and item and things like that. It's been built heavily on input from Europe, and UBL also has a focus on backward compatibility. We will look a bit about that when we see the namespaces later on, to maintain XML compatibility between minor version upgrades. And there's also additional guidelines available for customization, for handling a code list and signatures. There's localizations or translations of parts of the library, at least. You can see here that UBL 1, version 1 was translated into a set of languages, Asian languages, and UBL 2 with some additional European languages. So that is something that can be also added on if there is a need from the user communities. The UBL TC can set up a working group for creating a localization. And it's primarily the name of the business terms and the definitions which are translated. And looking at the architecture, I will not go into the all depth of the technical aspects of how to build these XML schemas and libraries, but I will kind of mention it so that you are introduced to the concepts. And true for both UBL and for cross-industry invoice, it's based on a technology or a specification called Core Components Specification, or Core Component Technical Specification, which is used to build the components necessary on a semantic level. And naming and design rules for XML is used to create the actual XML schemas. I will give you so, for example, this is if it's readable on your screens, but this is just an example of a spreadsheet where you can see the semantic level of a library, where we have the address component, which with all its subcomponents such as street name and post box, city, and so on. And as you can see, the business terms are divided into parts in a structured and standardized way. And this is how the semantic level of the standards are maintained. Slightly different approach in CEFACT and in UBL, but on a first glance, this is how it works. UBL also has a syntax representation for binary format, and also now under development a JSON representation instead of or in addition to XML, for those who want to use JSON instead. So the semantic level we now have here on the left side, where we have a rule set called UBL naming and design rules, and these are used then to create the XML schema. So the schemas are never handmade or changed or in any way. They are always generated based on the semantic level. So that is, and the UBL NDR then maps that an object in the semantic level, that's an element perhaps in the XML schema, and so on. So this is the background or the methodology used. I also want to mention a bit about use of code list in XML schemas. XML schemas, and we talked about this at the last webinar, I think, for those of you who participated at that. XML schema can have enumerations of code values which define the value domain allowed for a specific element. So the code list is then published as an integrated part of the XML schema. It has benefits and it has some drawbacks. It requires, if you add a new code, you would have to issue a new schema, and there are compatibility issues between publications. That's a challenge. In case of UBL, is not using any enumerations, so it's no tightly bound code list. Instead, UBL is pointing to the code list in the documentation, and then the data types or the elements have supplementary components or attributes used to say which code list is being used. And then when the XML is validated, it is a two-phase validation. So you do the XML validation, and then you can do the code list validation, but it's two steps rather than just one validation of the XML schema containing both the structure and the codes. So this is something to have in mind. When it comes to use of namespaces and versions, the UBL has two document types, or actually two schemas, one for invoice and one for credit note, which are used in the context of the European standard. You can see the namespaces. I put them out here. The major version number is part of the namespace. The minor version number is stated in the message itself in a specific element. So that means that there are no changes in namespaces in new versions of the schemas. So that's one thing to remember. Also, there is something called a UBL extension. This is not the same thing as the extensions defined by CEN TC 434 when you extend the data model. This is something that comes into the syntax that all documents in UBL has a first element, which is an extension point where the users or the implementers may want to add their own XML as extensions. And there are some metadata about the extension. That is something that is not used in the context of the European standard either. But for communities where this might be useful, it's quite commonly implemented.